And we're recording. This is the Kubernetes SIG network meeting for Thursday, October 31st.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween, everybody. Does anybody have issue triage queued up to go?
Yeah, I got it queued.
Perfect. Thank you, Valerie.
It's actually very little this time.
Nice.
Extra perfect.
Okay. Added removing pods interrupts network for completely unrelated pod is our first one. So
Does somebody want to volunteer to look into this?
Again.
Thank you.
Do we know what network plugin they're using?
That would have been my first question. Now you took my signature move.
Oh, Romana.
yeah, I've never heard of that one.
I haven't heard of it in a while.
Yeah, so it's either the CNI or I suspect a situation where kubeproxy actually clears the records and adds the records for endpoint, and in between the load balancer won't work, but that will need looking into.
All right, next up is containers unable to resolve IPv6 local address. This one's using Calico.
I'm happy to do the first look into this.
Okay. All right, KubeNet not working with pod siders from node spec in 1.16. Looks like they haven't specified which CNI they're using.
If they say KubeNet, then that's the CNI.
Ah,
It uses the bridge plugin underneath.
gotcha. Any volunteers to take a look?
It looks like Antonio was already on it. You can add me there, it's fine. I can also take a look.
Okay.
Just around this Discord. Thank you.
AWS NLB service type stuck in pending when load balancer source range is set for one-sider.
We want to tag SIG to AWS as well. I don't see it there.
Yeah, I would actually untag network and just tag AWS.
All right. kubeproxy log shows failed to retrieve node info unauthorized. No follow-up yet. So looks like this is a problem with a new cluster.
What is actually responsible for setting up the cluster roles and such that kubeproxy is supposed to use? Is that kubeadm?
I believe so.
But doesn't RBAC initialize itself?
Well, something needs to actually generate the credentials and role that kubeproxy needs.
I mean, I guess.
But there's two separate things. Something needs to generate the role, and that's something we know at dev time. And then the credentials are specific to the node. So kubeadm would be responsible for setting up the credentials.
I mean, in any case, it doesn't seem like it's a network issue, right? It seems like it's more a KubeADM or some kind of setup issue, perhaps.
Most likely, yeah. Would that be node because it's a node bootstrapping problem, or cluster
Cluster
lifecycle?
lifecycle.
Okay. Next up, service to server or service to pod communication is broken. Bare metal with Calico. Okay, so they have a service. They're failing to connect to it.
You can give this one to me too, although it looks like there's an update. Yeah, I mean, you can still give it to me and I'll take a look.
Sorry, who's that in the room?
Sorry, that's Casey.
Issues reaching node ports on masters. Not much information here. I'm guessing they're using their master to actually schedule workloads. Anyone want to follow up?
You can stick me with that one. I haven't taken any today.
Okay.
You go there.
I may be getting stuff mixed up. I thought we didn't include masters in for node ports.
I thought it was possible if the user configures their cluster right, but I might be misremembering.
Well, they seem to claim it used to work and now it doesn't. So.
Mm-hmm. All right. Unable to perform initial IP allocation check, unable to refresh the service IP block.
Oh, is this still, I think I asked a follow-up. Go all the way down.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
Still waiting.
Yep.
Should we give it a bit
weeks,
longer, or should we close it?
I think we should close it.
Okay.
And see if that causes them to reopen it.
All right, that's easy. And last one in the queue, unable to connect to an HTTP service after upgrading to 1.13.7.
Did I comment on this one? It looks like it's assigned to me.
Yeah, also waiting for 2 weeks, so maybe we can close that as well. Yeah, not getting any feedback. All right, that's the backlog.
You probably want to tell him why you closed it. Or you just close.
Oh, I can go back in a second and do that.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Valerie.
Yep.
So we're talking about endpoints. Oh,
Sorry, anybody besides Valerie want to sign up for triage next time? Come on, look how much work this was. This was so difficult. Somebody?
Anyone here?
Yeah, I can do it.
That's Rob Scott.
Rob steps up to the plate. Valerie, you okay with that?
Yep, go for it.
All right.
shall I do endpoint slice next then?
Yes, please.
Go for it.
My hard stop is gone because the meeting was cancelled. So, is Rob around? Rob.
Yeah.
Right. So here is the situation we're in. Endpoint slice has a collection of endpoints. Did somebody say anything? No. Okay. So endpoint slice has a collection of endpoints, and the endpoints are mixed family. So a slice can have a bunch of endpoints here and a bunch of endpoints there and so on, which is fine from an endpoint perspective. And to my understanding, I don't know how the proxy deals with that, how a single family proxy can deal with that, right? So the problem happened, or the issue raised when, okay, I want to help that the endpoint slice to reach beta, which means we need to integrate it with the dual stack stuff we did. When I tried to do that, and then on like endpoint slice add, on endpoint slice delete, you just call the meta proxy, the proxy that implements it, and you expect that the proxy will work. Now the situation doesn't work because endpoint slice will have mixed endpoints versus what we used to have before with endpoints, where you know the endpoint family, so you call the correct proxy based on the family that you have from meta proxy. So we have, the way I see it, we have, unless I don't see the entire picture, we have two choices. Either we make endpoint slice per family, so the slice will always have one family, it doesn't matter which, all right? It doesn't even need to carry a flag for the family in terms of types. We can always check like the first IP in the slice, or we drop the meta proxy and we have a unified proxy that can do both, which to me sounds like something I don't want to even say, right? That would be really hard to implement.
Can we set a rule that each proxy needs to just filter, like taste each address and decide if it's for you or not?
So that way we call both blindly, and the base case of each one is this my family? If not, then ignore, correct. Silently ignore.
Are you my mother mode?
That might work. But there is nothing to tell us that, well, okay. We've had this situation before. I remember we had this talk about the service controller inside the API server, where you were talking about ignoring. The problem with ignoring is what most of them ignored it. How would you report that?
I mean, I imagine that a user would be pretty unhappy and filing bugs. But you're right in that there's no way to obviously feedback which ones got handled.
Yeah.
You're going on faith that they know how to interpret it, right? Address.
Can't the meta proxy do the checking? Like if this has IPv4 addresses, send it to this proxy. If it has IPv6 ones, send it to the other one.
So we can absolutely do that. The problem is you're going to have to create, out of a slice that has two families, you're going to have to create two slices and then call it down and then hope for the best, basically.
Well, but it could, I mean, we can just assume that the IPv4 proxy will process all of the v4 addresses in there. The v6 one will process all the v6 ones. And so as long as all the addresses are v4 or v6, then we know that neither proxy is going to ignore, or that there won't be any leftover ignored addresses. I was just responding to the question of, what if they get dropped.
Put it another way. Today, if there was a bug, I mean, what you're describing would be a bug, right? So if there was a bug in Kube proxy that it decided to ignore even numbered IP addresses, there's still nothing that's going to report that, right? Some user would have to figure it out and then file a bug saying, what the heck, guys, why did you div 2 on all these?
It's actually not going to be reported this way. They will be reporting that traffic doesn't reach my pods, and then.
That's right. And they're going to go investigate.
Tim's point is it's not any different really than the situation today. If you reject an individual IP address, we don't report that anywhere. I don't see how it would be a problem if you just passed it to both and they ignored things.
By the way, I'm not saying it's like we shouldn't go there. All I'm saying is if we go there, we need to understand that. But I do like what Dan was saying about splitting and then going. If one of them failed, then that's a failure. And in this case, we're not gonna need to. We're not gonna need to like ignore. We're just gonna split the endpoint slice at the level of.
Those endpoint slices can be heavy though. Like there can be a lot of them with a lot of data, and so copying all that data for the sake of, I don't know, not that much value, honestly. So when endpoint slice came, I think actually the very first version of it had separated IP4 and IP6. And I'll take the blame for saying, no, just do an IP. We can taste and see which one it is, right? We've written that function. my inclination is just to try this simple thing and do that. If that turns out to be difficult to implement, or if like there's actually failure modes, we can still go back to splitting v4 and v6 as separate address types.
Are we concerned about wasted work at each address gets passed twice when it's only going to be used once?
That's a good question. The wasted work is, we're going to call parse address or parse IP on each IP
That's
twice.
Or index, right?
I'm sorry. No, I thought
Sorry,
you were
Mike, go ahead.
talking about a solution that involves passing this mixed slice to two different proxies. So
Yeah.
And it's already happening for the endpoints object.
Yeah.
So
So
it's doing in the endpoints object already.
by the way, one of the things that as we move this to beta, we're not going to be able to change the API. So somehow I'm against getting the family of the slice, to be honest, and just keep, as long as the endpoint that the controller assigns the same family to the same slice, we should be fine. All right. So I'll tell you what, this is only impacts the endpoint slice part inside the Q proxy. So
But it's not true that we can't change the API. We can add, the address type is explicitly an enumeration, right? So we can add new values and say, for GA, the IP type is deprecated and the IP4 and IP6 types are preferred, if that's the direction that we really have to go. We're not locked in there.
Right.
The thing that I keep coming back to in my head, we already have code in kubeproxy that says, hey, this isn't an address that I understand, so I'm going to ignore it. Because we had a bunch of bugs filed where people had v6 addresses in otherwise v4 proxiers, and we were blowing up IP tables feeding it v6 addresses. So I think it was you, Minhan, who already went, or wasn't it you? Maybe it was Zihan, who went through and like every place where we take an IP address, we actually test it to make sure that it's the right family anyway.
all right.
We could probably log those.
Oh, we probably log them.
And
then ignore them.
Right, we wouldn't log these in this case, we just ignore them. But I don't think that's a big deal at all.
Yeah.
To be,
I think it's the simplest thing we can get away with, which is probably what we should do.
yeah. So by the way, and even that base case statement that we need to add, it only affects the part that the endpoint slice has. The existing proxies, because the existing type is per endpoint, and we're doing the check in the meta proxy anyway. So I will update the PR. I have a standing PR there. I will update the PR with touching the parts of the endpoint slice, just to ignore as it goes through the endpoints in the slice. It will ignore what doesn't match its own family.
Great. And if you want, you can log like a V10 or something.
Yeah.
And so if the user really wants to, they can set the vlog on it.
Yeah. That's definitely what's gonna happen. All right. We have a solution. Andrew,
I thought MetaProxy was only. Yeah, we're expanding that. MetaProxy seems like a decent answer for multifamily proxy.
Cool. Let's
thank you.
thanks everybody. Move on to the next one. Hermes.
Hey, yeah, I just wanted to say the two PRs for dual stack are ready for review. The first one is download API changes and also updating the host file with IPv6. And then the second one is basically adding support for multiple CIDR masks, one per family, IPv4 and IPv6. So I went with the suggestion that Tim and Andrew had, where we just have separate flags for IPv4 and IPv6, and the user can use that to configure in case of dual stack. So I just wanted to put it out there and say it's ready for review, and yeah.
Thank you. I know there's a bunch of PRs assigned to me. I've been unable to get to them in the last couple of weeks. I will be turning back to them next week.
Thanks.
Deadlines come up. So.
Yep, I know. I don't want anybody to miss the boat because of me, so I will get it done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bowie, you have a couple items up next.
Yeah, I mean, one is really brief is that I just put a link to the Ingress GA meeting notes if anyone is interested, and the meetings are recorded. So those are going on in alternate to this meeting, but in the same time slot. And I think we're going to try to figure out if there's like a better time slot. And the second item is that external DNS is moving to Kubernetes SIG. Has moved, but the PR hasn't been closed. Anyways, this is for on behalf of the external DNS team, just to kind of give people visibility about that.
Cool. Thanks, Bowie. I guess we'll move on to Rob for more endpoint slice discussion.
This is just a little bit of a weird one, I guess. There's a publish not ready addresses attribute on services, and that has a comment suggesting that it is to indicate if DNS implementations should publish the not ready addresses of subsets as ready. So basically to treat things that aren't ready as ready. It doesn't actually say anything about kubeproxy treating it that way or endpoints itself. Unfortunately, endpoints themselves and kubeproxy themselves have treated it a certain way that the comment doesn't suggest. Basically, going back historically, it seems like there was an annotation before this, something like around tolerate unready endpoints, and this is doing that same kind of functionality all over again. We had initially ignored that and decided we weren't going to do that with endpoint slices because it didn't seem like it was specified to do that. But as we thought about it more, as I thought about it more, as endpoint slices are going to beta, no one's intentionally upgrading to them. So any kind of change in functionality is something that somebody would not expect. So my idea, and I have a PR linked in the agenda, is to actually continue to support the publish not ready addresses behavior that endpoints specified. And likely if we do that, we should update the comment to suggest what it actually does. Because that right now, it seems like that attribute suggests that it's only relevant to DNS, not actual kubeproxy or other implementations. But as it turns out, endpoints and now endpoint slices are also paying attention to that attribute.
And sorry, is that a field on service or a field
that's a field on service.
I remember having this discussion. I think it was Clayton who insisted on this at the beginning. Yeah. I remember not liking it then, and I still don't like it. But yeah, I think you're right. For compatibility, we probably have to do it.
Yeah, and so yes, we probably need to. There's a corresponding issue that's been open for around 2 years now that the behavior is not what the documentation suggests. So we should probably update that as well.
At this point, we can only fix the documentation.
Right. So unless there are any big reasons to change things now, I think just continuing on with how things behaved before. Cool.
It's a pretty niche thing, so it's not going to impact too many people. All right.
But at the same time, it drops the support for the annotation.
That is true.
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
Make sure there's a rel note that you're dropping the support for that annotation.
Yeah. Dropping annotation is always interesting.
Even alphas. Even though we reserved the right to do it with no warning, and we gave people 2 years of warning, it will still break somebody.
Yeah, it was an alpha annotation that I think was mentioned could be dropped by 1.13, and so we're talking about 1.17 now. So
we're gonna break an obscure cluster somewhere under somebody.
It'll probably break somebody.
I'm sure it will. This is the other side of the coin of being successful, I guess.
We've just got one more thing on the agenda. Updating kubeproxy to not track cluster pod cider.
Right. So Satya here, I'll be raising a cap for this, but just wanted to tee off the idea and the discussion. So today we've been trying to think through how would we evolve clusters, let's say, to grow after you created them, maybe by adding things like discontiguous CIDRs to it, or trying to fit a Kubernetes cluster, let's say, if you have a bunch of disjoint address spaces, things like that. And in order to be able to even do those things, one of the things that we noticed is that there is baked-in assumptions in kubectl that everything that represents the cluster's pod is represented by a single CIDR, right? So it uses in three places, and the KEP will call it the three places. Three places uses the cluster CIDR to determine essentially if the traffic originated from within the cluster or not, so that it can basically decide to masquerade the traffic as it comes in. So the thing that we've been thinking through and what we are trying to see if we can do is to replace that logic by something else which does not depend on the cluster CIDR for the same functionality, right? So in the case of IP tables implementation, the three rules are, there is one rule that basically uses the cluster CIDR and says if the source of the traffic is not a cluster CIDR and if the traffic is addressed to a service IP, then masquerade by the node IP, right? So this essentially is handling use cases where you could announce, let's say, an advanced route to a node for the service IP range, send traffic to the service IP from outside the cluster, and expect it to work. Now, if we assume, like if we take a step back and think about how IP tables is used, all pod traffic that is leaving the node today essentially is translated at the node boundary before it leaves the node, right? So if pod A within a node A tries to send a traffic to a service IP, it will go in and get denatted by the pod IP before it actually leaves the node. So if you now assume, and which is we think the fairly reasonable assumption to say all pod to service translation for traffic within the cluster happens at the node boundary before the traffic leaves the node, then we can actually simplify this idea of using the cluster ID, cluster IP to determine whether the source for within the cluster to just the node spot CIDR. So essentially we can say if the traffic is not from the node spot CIDR, then it did not originate from inside the cluster. Which essentially means that we don't expect in normal cases for pod A to have destination of source IP and reach node B, which is outside the node boundary of which the pod belongs, right? So that's one reasoning behind. That's one way to think about this problem. The second use case that we have is to say
but back on that use case,
yeah,
it sounds like you just ruled out a use case, right? Which is you're proposing to stop supporting traffic from outside the cluster coming in through that node.
No, I was just saying we rewrite the rule from saying instead of saying source is cluster CIDR, we rewrite to say if source is not node spot CIDR and have the same rule.
Basically, I think Satya showed me this, and I think what we have today is actually strictly wrong. It just hasn't been triggered by anybody. Basically, if the traffic arrives at my node somehow from anywhere except
you're right.
my
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. Yes.
Yeah. So I think that one is
I
safe.
agree.
I don't know if I like do the whole KEP here or
I don't want to do the whole KEP, but that's the idea around this thing. The other rule was essentially there is a rule that says if a pod reaches out to the load balancer IP, don't send it outside the cluster, but actually short circuit to the service chain. And we can apply the same logic. Essentially, you're translating the node boundary before the pod leaves the node, so we can rewrite the rule in just terms of the node spot CIDR instead of the cluster CIDR. And there's a third case where we accept traffic that's related and accepted. There we still say cluster CIDR. The hypothesis is if it's already accepted and the connection state is related or established, we could just drop the reference to the cluster CIDR, right? So what this will allow us to do is then the kubeproxy implementation, and there's similar translation of IPVS, which I will call out in the KEP, will then allow us to stop tracking the cluster CIDR as part of the kubeproxy with IPVS or IP tables implementation, which case we can have other models of doing pod IP allocation at the cluster level, which doesn't have to coordinate any changes at the routing level for services, right? And that's the essential KEP and hypothesis on how we want to think about this problem.
So I realized I should have asked a different question. The node IP thus far is only advisory. It's not required to be a restriction that's followed, right?
Could you clarify that?
Yeah. Right now, I'm free in my CNI plugin to do IPAM any way I like. I don't have to allocate an address that's within the node IP. As long as it's within the cluster IP range, I'm good, right?
If you do that, then these rules would basically, you would not, if your CIDR that you assign to the pod happens to be within the cluster CIDR, but without the pod CIDR, you're saying the current rules will work, but in the new model, it will not work. Is that the
Right.
thing?
Right. That's the difference you're making, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So, Mike, I think you are correct. I know you are correct, in fact.
Right.
It's a great point. Today, cluster CIDR is an optional flag to kubeproxy, and everywhere that uses it is wrapped with an if not nil, otherwise log. I can't tell whether this is internal or external, so I'm going to ignore it.
Actually, my point was a little different. My point was the node, the division of cluster IP range amongst the nodes producing node IP ranges. Those node IP ranges are also just advisory, right?
That is correct. So for those environments, we'll need to make sure there's a way, if you want to trigger these sorts of functionality, if you want to allow the node to act as a service gateway, then there'll have to be a way to say, this is the local traffic CIDR. I think at the bottom of the question is, how do I know whether traffic came from this machine or from a different machine?
If I may, if I say something.
Well, it's not necessary. Oh, sorry.
The only situation where what Mike's saying is valid, the only situation I've seen, at least so far, through is where we use the IPs for allocation from VPCs, or the VNets, where the cluster live in. And by definition, when you use that, you don't do nothing or snatting or anything. You just you go out with the IP you have because it's routable on the network. In essence, the entire kubeproxy is cluster CIDR in this discussion. However, we have no assertion there. We don't validate anything. So we may want to be careful while approaching that.
I think there are other situations as well. I mean, I know both Calico and Weave, for example, both do IPAM completely independently from the node CIDR allocations. And in Calico's case, there's not necessarily a single CIDR that you can say belongs to a node. There may be several. There may be complete /32 exceptions to that as well, depending on how the users configured their IPAM.
Okay. And in that case, do you also track multiple cluster CIDRs, or is the cluster CIDR still one contiguous range?
No, I don't think
either the user doesn't have the cluster CIDR set, or they have one all-encompassing cluster CIDR, but they're only actually allocating addresses from certain subsets of that, or other kind of awkward configurations. And Calico itself supports many disjoint CIDRs.
So would it be safe to say we need to boil this down to a more general statement of how do I know whether this traffic is local or not?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
And if we want to go down that path, the other way of doing this by completely dropping the notion of a cluster CIDR is to be able to say, if we assume all pods have interfaces that start with a prefix, we can rewrite the rule to say, if the source came from an interface with this prefix name plus, then we assume it's local traffic, and otherwise we assume it's not local traffic, right?
Which that works for Calico.
Would work for, yeah.
Okay, so I think we can think about that. That's a great feedback. Thank you, Mike. And actually, I didn't realize that Weave and Calico did weird IPAM. So, I mean, you know, normal IPAM, we're the ones who are weird, actually. But, those are great points.
I don't think the prefix thing would work for OpenShift because at least at this point we don't have a particular prefix. And again, you only get 15 characters for the interface. And so depending on how many pods you have on that particular.
But as far as IP tables is concerned,
ton zero.
Yes. Everything is coming from ton zero. The VETHs don't matter.
Yeah. But that also doesn't have a prefix. So unless that prefix is configurable,
ton zero.
Well, right. But unless that prefix is configurable in some way.
Well, of course it would be, yes.
I mean, if we are talking about
we'll
traffic from an interface, then yes, that is the other way to do it, because every single network plugin, for the most part, is going to know where its pod traffic is entering the host's network namespace.
Right. So I think what we end up with is a flag that says, here's how you figure out local versus non-local, and there will be a suite of options that we can choose. One would be interface prefix, one might be it's a member of this CIDR, one might be you are on a bridge, one might be I don't know what else. But like we can start to build that up as sort of a more flexible method.
Or not these
Yeah.
interfaces will you want to enumerate in 0
Sure,
to
or
1,
yes, the
right?
opposite
As an
of-
the opposite of from this interface.
I mean,
possibly.
I guess I would start with maybe doing the interface prefix thing, but then also could we not do just a range of cluster CIDRs? I mean, would that handle the Calico case?
That's what
So what's a range of CIDRs?
Not a
So-
range, but a list. Sorry, an array or a list of CIDRs, cluster CIDRs.
Right now, you actually have that. We just limit it to dual families.
We have it limited to one, and it's
Right.
specifically called cluster CIDR, right?
Yes.
So I think what we want to do is break the idea that it is the cluster CIDR,
Right.
and say there's going to be a family of ways to configure local testing for kubeproxy, and we'll have to just update all the proxiers to understand all the mechanisms, which is okay. There's only 3 or 4 that I think are actually affected, which is I guess all of them, but that seems fine. For the sake of time, I don't think we need to hash it all out here, but I think that's great. So
Right.
your KEP just got a lot more complicated.
Yes. So I'm assuming we'll have more discussions once we do the PR on the CAP. But yes.
Right. But my point for the
Thank
KEP
you.
was you could start with just 2 methods, potentially. And then if people need other methods later, like inverse of these interfaces or something like that, then you could add those later.
Right.
I don't think we have to be
And
too
for
complicated to start with.
compatibility, obviously, for cluster CIDR is not going to go away. So anybody who's working today will be fine. But this will be additive. Awesome.
Thank you.
Just one last question. When you say prefix, you mean the interface name prefix?
Yes.
Okay.
Minus I some prefix plus, essentially.
But then you don't know the remote part, right?
No, but you don't need to know the remote part.
That's the point.
No, but you actually need to know the remote part before to say if you want to do masquerade or not, right?
Well, like we know Calico sets up all of its VETH pairs as Cali dash some hash. So we know that any interface that starts with Cali dash is a local traffic. And so we don't need to masquerade those, right? Kubernetes overall did not think ahead to put a prefix on this. So like,
No, I was thinking about source masquerade, which is decided by your destination.
that's a different problem.
Oh,
That's the
okay.
that's the mask agent problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
The thing that was surprising to me was, when Satya asked about this, like how little we're actually relying on that CIDR. So I'm glad that it's actually fairly easy to get rid of. Because I don't know about you guys, but I have customers all the time who are saying, I messed up, I didn't plan enough room for my cluster, and I need more.
Well, that's why, like Calico, we added the ability to expand the cluster CIDR and did a list of cluster CIDRs effectively.
Well, I think that's where we want to go. Like,
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I remember you saying about like reconfiguring the cluster CIDR on a running cluster without having to mess around, and service CIDR as well. This might be a way into this. So as we approach this KEP, we have to have that as one of the things we think about.
That's right. And conveniently, Cal, you already laid all the groundwork for the CIDRs being a list flag. So I told you this was going to come.
Yeah. It's not going to be easy though, because as you change the list, you may, so you can always add, but you cannot leave. It's Hotel California kind of situation.
That's probably true.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But this KEP is not making the multi-CIDR work. It's just making kubeproxy ready for multi-CIDR.
Yes, which will help. Yes, I agree.
So we're 3 weeks out from KubeCon. I hope to see lots of people there. We should set up a doodle or something to figure out a time for a meetup, just to get together and grab lunch or something for all the people who will be there. Bowie, I know did you start on the deep dive stuff?
I did.
He has started thinking about the deep dive.
Yeah, and Bowie, I know you poked me about that as well. I'm still interested in helping out. I just cannot do that this week.
Okay, all right.
And who's doing the intro? Is it still you, Valerie?
Yeah, I should check in with you guys just to make sure we're not overlapping too heavily since they're scheduled back to back.
Yes, please make sure that they blend correctly. Awesome. Looking at the KubeCon agenda, there are a ton of really awesome talks, and I can't wait to see what everybody's been doing. I like your costume, by the way, Valerie.
Yeah.
All right.
How about you guys? But after KubeCon, I'm off for about a month, 34 days. So
For you.
Nice.
yeah.
Nice.
Okay.
I think that's all we've got, unless there are any other last minute topics. Cool. I'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
See ya.
Bye, everybody.
Okay, one more call before